A sense of unproductivity can appear even while you are actively working, creating a gap between effort and perceived progress. Time is being spent, tasks are being approached, and attention is directed towards something, yet the result does not feel substantial. At the end of the day, it may seem as though much was done, but little was actually completed in a meaningful way. This experience is often interpreted as a lack of discipline or inefficiency, but the cause is not always visible at that level. Work is happening, but the way attention is being used has changed. Instead of moving in a continuous and stable direction, attention begins to fragment. Focus shifts more frequently, not always in obvious ways, but through small interruptions that are easy to overlook. A quick check, a brief thought, or a minor distraction can break the continuity of attention without fully stopping the task. Because these interruptions are short, they do not register as a problem. However, each one resets the depth of focus, preventing attention from fully engaging with the work. As a result, effort is applied, but it does not accumulate. The system remains active, yet progress feels limited. This is how productivity begins to decline, not through inactivity, but through a pattern where attention never fully settles long enough to produce meaningful output. Short interruptions appear insignificant because they do not fully stop what you are doing. Work continues, the task remains open, and attention returns quickly enough that it feels like nothing important was lost. However, what changes is not the presence of attention, but its depth. Each time focus is broken, the system must rebuild the context it was previously holding. This process is not immediate. Even if you return to the same task, the level of clarity, connection, and momentum is reduced. The mind needs time to re-enter the structure of the work, to recall what mattered, and to rebuild the chain of thought. When interruptions happen repeatedly, this rebuilding process becomes constant. Instead of progressing forward, attention keeps restarting. This creates an illusion of activity. You are engaged, but not advancing at the same rate. Energy is being used to reorient rather than to produce. Over time, this shifts the experience of work. Tasks feel longer, thinking feels heavier, and progress feels slower than expected. Not because the task is difficult, but because attention is never allowed to stabilize. This is how fragmentation begins to affect productivity, not by stopping work, but by preventing attention from reaching the level where meaningful output can occur. A fragmented way of working does not continue by accident, because the mind is being pulled by patterns that feel immediately rewarding. Small shifts in attention often provide a brief sense of relief, novelty, or stimulation, even when they interrupt something important. A quick glance at another tab, a short mental detour, or a momentary check outside the task can feel minor. Yet each one offers an easier form of engagement than sustained effort. Because of this, the brain begins to associate switching with comfort. Deep work usually asks for more from the system. It requires continuity, patience, and the willingness to stay with material that may not feel instantly rewarding. In contrast, distraction offers immediate change. That difference matters. The system learns quickly from what feels easier in the moment, especially when the cost is delayed rather than immediate. As a result, frequent shifting can become automatic. Attention starts to move, not because the task should be interrupted, but because the brain has learned that movement itself provides a small reward. Once this becomes familiar, staying with one thing begins to feel slightly harder than switching away from it. This is how distraction becomes a habit structure. Not because you consciously choose fragmentation, but because your system has learned to prefer the short-term ease of changing focus over the slower reward of sustained concentration. As this pattern continues, a deeper shift begins to take place in how effort and reward are connected. Sustained focus starts to feel less engaging, not because it has no value, but because it does not provide immediate feedback. In contrast, switching between tasks or inputs creates a constant stream of small rewards. Each shift introduces something new, even if it is irrelevant to the original goal. Over time, this reshapes what the system begins to prefer. Attention is no longer drawn toward depth, but toward variation. This preference does not develop consciously. It emerges through repetition. The more often attention is rewarded for switching, the more natural that behavior becomes. As a result, staying with a single task begins to feel slightly uncomfortable. Not intensely difficult, but subtly resistant. That resistance is enough to encourage another shift. This is where productivity begins to decline more significantly. Work is still happening, but it is happening at a surface level. Tasks are approached, but not fully processed. Time is invested, but not converted into meaningful progress. This creates a disconnect. Effort increases, yet results do not match that effort. The system is active, but not aligned with the kind of focus that produces depth. This is how productivity is gradually weakened, not by stopping work, but by changing how attention is rewarded and directed. A common result of fragmented attention is the feeling that time has been used, but not translated into meaningful output. Hours may pass with continuous activity, yet when you look back, the amount of completed work feels unexpectedly small. This creates a specific kind of frustration. Effort is present, but progress is unclear. That disconnect often leads to the assumption that something is wrong with how hard you are trying. However, the issue is not always effort. It is how attention is distributed across that time. When attention is divided into short, repeated segments, each segment carries less depth. Even if the total time adds up, the quality of engagement within that time remains shallow. As a result, work does not accumulate in a way that produces visible results. This is where the difference between being busy and being productive becomes clear. Busyness is defined by activity. Productivity is defined by meaningful progress. Without sustained attention, activity increases while progress slows down. This creates an illusion. You feel occupied, yet the outcome does not reflect that effort. Over time, this pattern can lead to a loss of clarity about what effective work actually looks like. It becomes harder to distinguish between movement and advancement. When results do not match effort, a common response is to increase the amount of time spent working because it feels like the most direct way to compensate for what seems to be missing. If progress feels insufficient, extending work hours appears logical, as more time should, in theory, produce more output. However, when attention is already fragmented, increasing time does not correct the underlying condition that is limiting productivity. The same pattern continues, only across a longer duration. Instead of deeper engagement, the system repeats shallow cycles of attention, where focus is frequently interrupted and rebuilt without reaching stability. As this continues, fatigue begins to accumulate in a way that directly affects how attention functions. Clarity becomes harder to maintain, and the effort required to stay with a task increases. This leads to more frequent shifts in attention, not because the task demands it, but because the system can no longer sustain focus in the same way. With each interruption, productivity decreases further, which often leads to an additional increase in working time. At that point, effort and outcome begin to separate more clearly. More time is invested, but less meaningful progress is produced. What initially seemed like a solution gradually becomes part of the structure that maintains the problem. Without changing how attention operates, adding more time only extends the same pattern that reduced productivity in the first place. As this pattern continues, the ability to focus does not remain stable, but gradually becomes more difficult to sustain, even when you consciously try to concentrate. What changes is not your intention to focus, but the condition of the system that is attempting to hold attention. Mental fatigue plays a central role in this shift. When attention has been repeatedly fragmented, the system spends more energy on switching, reorienting, and rebuilding context than on actual processing. This continuous internal effort reduces the available capacity needed for sustained focus. As a result, trying to concentrate begins to feel heavier than it should. Even when you remove distractions and attempt to focus, attention does not immediately stabilize. Instead, it drifts more easily, requiring repeated effort to bring it back. This creates a frustrating experience. The more you try to force concentration, the more resistance you encounter. That resistance is not a lack of willpower. It reflects a system that has already been depleted by repeated fragmentation. Under these conditions, effort does not translate directly into focus. It often increases strain without improving stability. This is why concentration feels unreliable in this state. The system is still active, but it no longer supports sustained attention in the same way. A short break does not always restore focus when the system that supports attention has not actually recovered from the pattern that weakened it. Stepping away from work may reduce immediate pressure, but that alone does not rebuild the stability that sustained concentration depends on. If mental fatigue remains in place, attention returns with less strength than expected, even after rest. This is what makes the experience confusing. You stop, pause, and try again. Yet the same difficulty appears almost immediately. The problem is not that rest has no value, but that rest does not automatically reverse fragmentation. A system that has been trained to shift constantly does not return to depth simply because activity pauses for a moment. The habit of switching remains active beneath the surface. Because of that, attention often comes back in the same fragmented form it had before the break. Another issue is that shallow rest often continues the same pattern in a different shape. The task may stop, yet the mind keeps scanning, checking, or drifting between small inputs that prevent deeper recovery. This means the system is no longer working intensely, but it is not fully resetting either. Focus cannot recover fully in that condition. What returns after the break is not renewed concentration, but a slightly rested version of the same unstable attention pattern. Fragmented attention does not only reduce speed, but gradually changes the depth at which you are able to think. When focus is repeatedly interrupted, the mind does not have enough time to build and maintain complex connections between ideas. Each return to the task begins closer to the surface, rather than continuing from where deeper understanding was forming. This affects the quality of output in ways that are not always immediately visible. Work may still be completed, but it lacks the refinement, structure, and clarity that come from sustained engagement. Ideas remain underdeveloped, decisions rely on partial processing, and solutions tend to stay within what is immediately accessible. This is why productivity cannot be measured only by how much is done. The depth of thinking determines the value of what is produced. Without stable attention, thinking becomes shorter, more reactive, and less integrated. This creates a pattern where output increases in quantity but decreases in quality. Over time, this can lead to a sense that work is not improving, even with continued effort. The system is active, but it is no longer operating at the level required for meaningful progress. This is how productivity is gradually reduced, not only in how much is accomplished, but in how well it is done. What makes this pattern difficult to break is that it reinforces itself without requiring a deliberate decision. Each interruption weakens the stability of attention, and that reduced stability makes further interruptions more likely. As focus becomes less consistent, the effort required to maintain it increases. That increased effort creates subtle discomfort, even if it is not fully recognized. The mind begins to look for relief from that discomfort. Switching attention provides that relief, even when it is brief. Because the relief is immediate, the behavior is repeated. Over time, this creates a loop. Weaker focus leads to more switching, and more switching leads to weaker focus. Nothing in this process feels extreme. It develops through small, repeated shifts that gradually change how attention operates. Another factor is that returning to depth requires more than simply deciding to focus again. The system needs time to rebuild continuity, and if another interruption occurs before that happens, the process resets once more. This prevents attention from stabilizing long enough to regain its previous strength. As a result, the ability to focus deeply becomes less accessible, even though the intention to do so remains. Attempts to fix this problem often turn toward willpower, because it seems like a matter of discipline rather than structure. When focus feels unstable, the immediate response is to try harder, to resist distraction, and to force attention to stay in place. At first, this approach can create short periods of improvement. You may notice moments where concentration holds longer than before. However, this improvement rarely lasts. Maintaining focus through effort alone requires continuous control, which itself consumes mental resources. As those resources are used, the system becomes more fatigued, making attention even harder to stabilize over time. This creates a contradiction. The method used to improve focus begins to weaken the very capacity it depends on. Instead of building stability, it increases strain. Another limitation appears in how willpower operates. Control can interrupt behavior, but it does not change the underlying pattern that drives it. The tendency to switch attention remains, even if it is temporarily suppressed. Because of this, the system eventually returns to its default behavior once effort decreases. This is why the problem feels persistent. It is not a failure of effort, but a mismatch between the approach and the structure that needs to change. Sustainable focus does not come from forcing attention, but from altering the conditions that make fragmentation the easier option. A meaningful shift begins when the focus moves away from forcing attention and toward changing the conditions that allow attention to stabilize naturally. Sustained focus is not something that is created directly through effort, but something that emerges when interruptions become less dominant. When the environment and internal patterns both support continuity, attention no longer needs to be held in place through constant control. One important change involves reducing unnecessary entry points for distraction. Not every potential interruption needs to be managed individually. Instead, limiting how often attention is exposed to new inputs creates a more stable baseline. Fewer inputs reduce the number of times attention is pulled away before it has fully settled. Another adjustment appears in how tasks are approached. When work is structured in a way that allows continuity, attention can build gradually instead of restarting repeatedly. This does not require perfect conditions. It requires enough consistency for focus to deepen over time. Internal patterns also matter. Allowing thoughts to pass without immediate engagement reduces the tendency to follow every mental shift. This creates space where attention can remain with the task rather than moving automatically. Stability develops when both external and internal interruptions are reduced to a level where attention can sustain itself without constant correction. Clarity begins to improve when you can identify which patterns are quietly consuming attention without contributing to meaningful progress. Many of these patterns are not obvious distractions, but small, repeated behaviors that feel harmless in isolation. Checking something briefly without a clear purpose, revisiting a thought that has already been resolved, or allowing attention to drift during transitions can all reduce stability. Each instance may seem minor, yet together they create a continuous fragmentation of focus. A useful way to approach this is by asking whether a shift in attention is necessary or simply automatic. Not every movement of attention is required. Some occur because the system has become used to switching rather than sustaining. Reducing these unnecessary shifts creates immediate improvement in how attention holds. Another important distinction appears in how tasks are entered. Starting work without clear direction often leads to early fragmentation, because attention does not have a stable path to follow. When the next step is unclear, the mind is more likely to search elsewhere. Defining a single point of focus before beginning reduces that tendency. This allows attention to move forward instead of outward. Small adjustments like these do not require drastic changes. They reshape how attention is used in everyday moments, which is where most fragmentation actually occurs. Maintaining stable attention is not about preventing every disruption, but about responding correctly when disruption occurs. Moments of lost focus are inevitable. What determines the overall pattern is how quickly and cleanly attention returns, without extending the interruption further. One common mistake is reacting to a break in focus by engaging with it. A brief distraction becomes longer when it is followed, analyzed, or allowed to expand. Instead of treating it as a temporary shift, it becomes a new direction for attention. A more effective approach is to recognize the shift without building on it. When attention moves, returning it without adding additional engagement prevents the interruption from growing. Another important factor is how you interpret moments of reduced focus. If every lapse is treated as failure, it creates unnecessary tension, which further destabilizes attention. A more useful perspective is to see these moments as part of the process. Attention is being retrained, and instability is expected during that transition. Responding without overreaction keeps the system from becoming more fragmented. Consistency does not come from perfect control. It comes from repeated, simple corrections that prevent small disruptions from turning into larger patterns. Over time, this builds a form of stability that does not depend on constant effort. At the core of this experience is not a lack of effort, but a pattern where attention is repeatedly divided before it has the chance to deepen. Work feels unproductive because energy is being spent on maintaining engagement rather than building momentum. Once this becomes clear, the problem is no longer interpreted as a failure to work harder, but as a structure that prevents effort from accumulating. A single principle can be used as a consistent reference point. Whenever attention shifts without necessity, progress is interrupted before it has time to form. Recognizing that moment changes how the next action is chosen. Instead of following the shift, attention is returned before the interruption expands. This does not require constant control or perfect discipline. It requires awareness of when attention is leaving the task without a clear reason. Each time that movement is interrupted early, continuity is preserved. Over time, this allows attention to reach a level where depth becomes possible again. Productivity begins to change not through increased effort, but through fewer interruptions. What returns is not just output, but the ability to stay with one thing long enough for meaningful progress to occur. That ability is what makes work feel productive again.